You shouldn't have done that.
I know.
Then let's end this.
My father-in-law waited until the whole family was seated for Thanksgiving dinner. Then he slid a manila envelope across the table, passed the turkey, and stopped it in front of me. "Divorce papers," he said, loud enough for the grandchildren to hear. "Sign them. You were never good enough for my daughter, and we're all done pretending you were." The table went silent. My wife wouldn't look at me, and I reached into my own jacket, and I set my own envelope down on the table next to his. "Before I sign anything, Charles," I said, "I think everyone should see what's in mine first. My name is Adam Foster. I'm 49 years old. I'm a forensic accountant. It's not a glamorous job. I find money that's hiding. Companies hire me to look at their books when they suspect someone inside is stealing, and I follow the numbers until they tell me the truth. Because numbers always tell the truth eventually, no matter how expensive the suit of the man moving them around. I've spent 20 years learning that one skill. It has never mattered more than it did at that Thanksgiving table. Because the man who slid divorce papers at me had spent 15 years certain I was beneath his family. He never once considered that the boring son-in-law who played with spreadsheets could read a ledger better than any man alive. And he'd made one catastrophic mistake. He let me look at his. Before I tell you what was in my envelope, do me one small kindness. If anyone has ever made you feel like you didn't belong, like you had to prove you were good enough for people who'd already decided you weren't, tap subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this story found the right person. And stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you something I still turn over, and I want your honest verdict. Let me tell you about the Whitmores. My wife, Rachel, comes from money. Old Connecticut money. The kind with a family name on a wing of the hospital, a compound on the shore, and a family trust spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. Her father, Charles Whitmore, is the patriarch. And from the moment Rachel brought me home 15 years ago, me, a middle-class kid whose father drove a delivery route, who put himself through school and did unglamorous work with numbers, Charles decided I was a mistake his daughter had made and would eventually correct. He never said it outright at first. It came in 1,000 small cuts. He'd introduce me at parties as Rachel's husband. He does something with taxes. He'd forget to include me in the men's golf outings, then apologize with a smile that said he hadn't forgotten at all. At every holiday, he'd hold court about the family's investments and legacy, and if I offered a thought, me, a professional in exactly that field, he'd give a little laugh and change the subject as if the help had spoken. The wedding was the tell, if I'd been paying attention. Charles gave a toast that everyone called charming, in which he welcomed me to the family by joking that Rachel had always had a soft spot for a fixer-upper. People laughed. Rachel squeezed my hand under the table, and I filed it away with the rest, the way you do, telling myself it didn't matter what he thought of me as long as I had her. For 15 years, I believed the smallness was the whole of it, that Charles was just a snob, harmless as a bad smell. It never occurred to me that a man that invested in looking a certain way might be capable of anything to keep the picture from cracking. Contempt I could live with. I had no idea it was covering something. Rachel and I were happy anyway. We built a good, quiet life, a real one, with 2 kids of our own and a marriage that had weathered everything. For 15 years, Charles's contempt was just whether I walked through to get to my wife. I could take it. I'd been underestimated my whole life. It stopped hurting a long time ago. What I couldn't take, what changed everything, was the thing I found in the numbers. About a year ago, Charles's longtime accountant retired, and there was a gap before the new firm took over, and Rachel's mother, Patricia, asked me quietly if I'd just glance at the family trust paperwork to make sure nothing fell through the cracks. She asked me instead of Charles because, she said, Charles had been strange about the finances lately. I said, of course. It was the first time in 15 years anyone in that family had treated my profession as something other than an embarrassment. I glanced at it, and then I stopped glancing, and I started reading the way I read a fraud case. Because something was wrong. It's hard to explain to people who don't do what I do, but a set of books has a feel to it, the way a house has a feel when someone's been in it. Honest numbers breathe evenly. These didn't. There were transfers that were just slightly too round, on dates that were just slightly too convenient, to names that were just slightly too generic. 20 years of catching thieves, and the hair on my neck stood up before I could have told you why. So I did what I'm trained to do. I stopped trusting the labels on the money, and I followed where it actually went. The Whitmore Family Trust, the one spoken of in hushed tones, the one meant to secure the futures of Rachel, her sister, and all the grandchildren, including my own kids, was being drained. Quietly, systematically, for years. Money was flowing out in a pattern I've seen 100 times in 100 embezzlement cases, dressed up as management fees and investment vehicles and transfers to entities with respectable-sounding names that, when I pulled the thread, dissolved into nothing. Shell companies, mailboxes, names on paper with no business behind them. Charles was stealing from his own family's trust, methodically, for years, from a fund meant to protect his own grandchildren. And I could see exactly where the money was going. If you're still with me, do me that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you where it went. Because that's the part that told me who Charles Whitmore really was under the old money manners. It was going two places. The first was to cover an enormous hole. Charles had made a series of catastrophic private investments over the years, ego-driven bets that had failed spectacularly. And rather than admit he'd lost the family's real fortune, he'd been secretly draining the trust to keep up the appearance that the Whitmores were still the Whitmores. The compound, the parties, the golf club, the whole performance of wealth, it was being funded by robbing his own grandchildren's futures a little at a time, so no one would notice until it was gone. And the second place the money went was worse. There was a second household, an apartment in the city, a car, a steady stream of support to a woman who was not Patricia going back years. Charles had a whole secret life, and he was funding it out of the trust meant for his daughters and their children. I sat with that for a long time. I had in my hands proof that the man who'd looked down on me for 15 years was hollowing out his own family to fund his failures and his secrets. And I did not know what to do with it, because the moment I said a word, I would detonate my wife's entire family. Her image of her father, her mother's marriage, everything. So I did the careful thing first. I went to Charles, privately, man to man, in his study with the door closed. I laid a summary in front of him, not the whole file, just enough that he'd know I knew, and I watched him read it. And I told him he needed to stop, come clean to the family, and to start putting it right, and that I'd help him do it quietly. I meant it. I offered to sit beside him while he told Patricia. I offered to help him restructure what was left, protect the grandchildren's futures, even protect his dignity as much as a man in his position can be protected. I gave the man who'd humiliated me for 15 years a genuine off-ramp because I loved his daughter and I didn't want to be the one who burned down her family. I'll never forget his face while he read. It wasn't shame. I kept waiting for shame, and it never came. What crossed his face was calculation. He set the paper down, and he looked at me, not like a man who'd been caught, but like a man assessing a threat. And I understood, too late, that I'd made a serious mistake, because I'd forgotten what kind of man I was dealing with. Charles didn't take the off-ramp. Charles decided the problem wasn't what he'd done. The problem was that I knew. And a man like Charles doesn't fix the leak. He gets rid of the person who noticed it. So over the next few months, he went to work, not on the trust, on me. He started, quietly, poisoning Rachel against me. Little things, planted with a father's practiced hand. Has Adam been asking a lot about the family money lately? Patricia mentioned he's been very interested in the trust. I worry he married you with an eye on all this, sweetheart. I've always worried. He's been going through our private financial documents. Did you know that? Doesn't that concern you? He took the truth that I'd found his theft, and he twisted it into a story where I was the schemer, the gold digger, the outsider who'd been after the Whitmore money all along. And it worked a little. That's the part that broke my heart. Rachel started to get quiet, distant. She'd look at me strangely when money came up, and once she asked me, carefully, why I'd been so interested in Daddy's finances lately, and I heard her father's exact word come out of my wife's mouth. 15 years of marriage, and I watched Charles slowly turn my own wife's eyes cold, using the very evidence of his crime as proof of mine. He was that good. He'd figured out that the truth was his greatest danger, so he got to it first and repainted it. Cast the man who found the theft as the thief, and the thief as the worried father protecting his little girl. It's the oldest move there is, and it nearly worked because the person he was lying to was someone who loved and trusted him with her whole heart. Those are always the easiest people to deceive. Not the strangers, the ones who love you. I realized what was coming. Charles wasn't just going to freeze me out. He was going to force me out. In the marriage, get rid of the one person who could expose him and rewrite himself as the protective father who'd saved his daughter from a mercenary. And he'd do it dramatically, publicly, in a way that made it final. So I did what I do. I came prepared. I pulled everything. Every statement, every transfer, every phantom entity, every payment to the second household, all of it documented and organized the way I'd organize it for a courtroom into a single envelope. And I made 2 copies. And I waited because I knew Charles, and I knew he wouldn't be able to resist a stage. I knew the move would come at a family gathering, where the humiliation would be public and the pressure on Rachel would be greatest. I just didn't know he'd pick Thanksgiving. With the grandchildren at the table, we were all seated. Patricia had just brought out the turkey, and Charles stood and got that theatrical look he gets and reached under his chair and slid the manila envelope across the table to me. "Divorce papers," he said. "Sign them. You were never good enough for my daughter, and we're all done pretending you were." He looked around the table, gathering his audience. "Rachel, sweetheart, you don't have to say anything. We all know. It's time." And I looked at my wife, and I saw her face caught between the story her father had spent months building and 15 years of knowing me, and I understood that whatever I did in the next 30 seconds would decide everything. So I didn't get angry. I reached into my jacket, calm as I've ever been, and I set my envelope down next to his. "Before I sign anything, Charles," I said, "I think everyone should see what's in mine first. Patricia, Rachel, I think you especially need to see it." Charles's face flickered. "This is a family matter, Adam, not one of your little audits. Open it." "Rachel," I said quietly, "please. You've been wondering for months if I'm a liar. Here's the truth, all of it, in your father's own numbers. Open it." And my wife, God bless her, picked up my envelope instead of his. I watched her read. The table was dead silent. Even the kids had gone still the way kids do when the air changes and they don't know why. I watched 15 years of trust and a few months of her father's poison fight out on my wife's face. And then I watched the numbers do what numbers always do. I watched her understand. The drained trust. Her children's college funds gone. The failed investments hidden under the family's name for a decade. Her hand started to shake as she turned the pages, and Charles's voice rose behind her, telling her to put it down, that it was manipulated, that I was twisting things. And she kept turning the pages anyway. And then she reached the last section. The apartment, the other woman, the car, the payments, years of it. All of it funded from the money meant for her and her sister and every grandchild sitting at that table waiting for pie. Rachel looked up from the pages, and she did not look at me. She looked at her father, and in a voice I'd never heard her use, she said to Dad, "What is this?" It was not a question. It was the sound of a daughter's whole world reorganizing itself in real time. Charles tried. Of course he tried. He blustered about how these were complex financial matters that Adam has obviously twisted, how a forensic accountant could make anything look like anything, how this was exactly the manipulation he'd warned everyone about. For about a minute, he threw everything he had at that table. But here's the thing about numbers and about a room full of people who've just seen them. You can talk your way around an accusation. You cannot talk your way around a bank statement with your own signature on the transfer, and a second one, and 100 more, all pointing in an apartment your wife of 40 years has never heard of. Patricia had my second copy in her hands by then, and it was Patricia, not me, who ended it. She looked at her husband across 40 years of marriage and the ruins of it, and she said one sentence. "Charles, whose apartment is this?" He had no answer. There isn't one. Now, let me tell you how it ended, because the ending is the part that matters. The family did not shatter the way Charles had gambled his whole play on. It shattered around him and closed ranks without him. Because I hadn't come to that table to destroy the Whitmores. I'd come to save them from the man who'd been quietly destroying them for years. And once the shock wore off, something happened that Charles, in all his contempt, never saw coming. The outsider he'd spent 15 years belittling became the one person the family actually needed. Rachel's sister called me the next morning, terrified about her kids' futures, and I walked her through exactly where they stood. Patricia asked me to sit with the family's new attorney. Suddenly, the man who did something with taxes was the only one in the room who could read the wreckage and find what could still be saved. And we saved a lot. With my help and a real attorney, we moved fast, secured what was left of the trust, froze Charles's access before he could move another dollar, clawed back what the law would let us claw back for the grandchildren. The theft was too old and too deep to undo completely. Some of that money is simply gone, spent on a life none of them ever knew about. But we saved enough. We saved the futures that actually mattered. The kids at that table will still go to college. That was the whole point. Charles and Patricia are divorced now. That's his envelope. In the end, not mine. She filed, and no one at that table blamed her. He's living, I understand, in the apartment. Alone. The performance of the Whitmore fortune is over, and the man who spent his life terrified of not looking wealthy enough now doesn't have to worry about appearances anymore, because there's no one left watching. And Rachel, my Rachel, she came to me that night, after the kids were asleep, and she sat on the edge of our bed, and she cried in a way I hadn't seen in 15 years. She apologized for every cold look, every doubt, every time she let her father's voice into her head over mine. And I pulled her in, and I told her the truth, that I never once blamed her. That Charles was the single best liar I've come across in 20 years of catching liars, and that if he could fool me for 15 years about who he was, he could certainly fool the daughter who adored him. Being deceived by your own father isn't a failing, I told her. It's just what it feels like sometimes to love someone. The shame belongs to the one who lies, never to the one who believed him. Our marriage didn't just survive Charles. It came out the other side stronger, and I mean that plainly. The worst thing that could ever be aimed at a marriage got aimed at ours. Public humiliation, a father's betrayal, months of poison, divorce papers slid across a holiday table in front of our children, and it held. There's a strange peace in that. We know now exactly what we're made of because we watched it get tested to destruction and not break. The grandchildren, by the way, don't know the details and won't until they're grown. To them, it was just a year Grandpa moved away. That's the one mercy I insisted on. Whatever Charles was, I wasn't going to let his crime become their childhood memory. I read numbers for a living, and I'll leave you with the truest thing that work ever taught me. You can hide a lie in a family for years. You can dress it in an old name and an expensive suit and a compound on the shore, and you can make everyone who doubts it feel small for doubting. But you cannot hide a lie in a ledger. The numbers don't care how good the performance is. They sit there, patient, adding up, and one day someone reads them in the daylight, and the whole beautiful story falls apart in a single column of figures. Every account balances in the end. Charles spent his life making sure his balanced in the dark. All I did was turn on the light. He slid divorce papers across the table to prove I was never good enough for his family. He should have remembered what I do for a living before he let me see his books. So here's my question, and I mean it. I exposed Charles at the Thanksgiving table in front of his wife and his daughters. Publicly, completely, no mercy. I could have done it quietly, privately, spared everyone the scene. But he came to me publicly with my children in the room, and I met him where he stood. Was I right to blow it all up at the table? Or does a man owe even his enemy a quieter door for the sake of the family caught in the middle? Tell me down in the comments. I made my choice in about 3 seconds, and I still wonder if it was the right one. If this story meant something to you, do me that kindness, subscribe, hit like, and remember that the quiet person your family underestimates is very often the one who sees everything, especially the numbers, especially the truth. I'll see you next time.